Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Living on Purpose, the show about intentionally crafting the happy, successful life you deserve. I'm your host, Mark Barton, author of the Living on Purpose course and owner of Bought In for the Win LLC, specializing in coaching, consulting, and training and development. If something in this episode resonates with you, please connect with me to discuss how I might bring some positive growth to you or your organization. Now, on with the show. Last week we discussed exercising good judgment, which is always one of my favorite topics. This week we're going to talk about something people typically think should be at the beginning of a cycle, developing goals. However, in the happiness success cycle method, it's the last thing because we want to make sure we're properly set up for success before we think about developing a goal. Goals are simply measurements of how closely we got to an expected outcome. Think back to elementary or middle school and the basic scientific method you were supposed to use for a science fair project. You would always have your question and stated hypothesis, and you would do the experiment and have some results. The question and hypothesis are equivalent to our life decisions, and the experiments are the goals, or testing if we can or can't accomplish what we decided, and the results simply tell us how close we got. In order to have better accuracy in our results, we should start with accurate experiments or goals. To do that, I use the SMART goals method. So let me take a minute to explain what that is before we get into our personal, organizational, and leadership level examples. So SMART goals don't have anything to do with how brilliant your goals are, but following this method would be a wise idea. SMART goals refers to an acronym, as you can see here, meaning that your goal is specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely. Now, there are a few different variations of this acronym, so don't come at me if you heard it in a slightly different way. I've included an example here of a well-crafted SMART goal. There are a couple elements that are very specific, such as the date and time, the use of the word all, which exam, and the specific score that we expect students to accomplish. This goal is measurable by the deadline, the number of students, and the score. We can tell it's actually action-oriented because of the verbs completed and scored. Now, without knowing some background information, it's a little difficult to tell if it's realistic or not, but in general, it seems like a fairly realistic goal. Lastly, this goal is timely because of the deadline, but this is also a judgment call depending on when the goal was created. Now that we have a good understanding of what a SMART goal really looks like, let me give you the 3 examples at the personal, organizational, and leadership levels that I encountered this week. So for this week's personal level example of developing goals, I'm going to shed some light on my professional career. As I mentioned in last week's episode, we lost several operational days because of the hurricane. As you might imagine, this caused a lot of rescheduling and some things fell through the cracks that first week back. I went into this week knowing I had to set up some SMART goals to try and help get myself back on track. Just like I said in the open though, goals are really only a measurement to tell us how closely we were to succeeding in something. On Monday, I took some time to see what areas I was behind in and try to create some priorities. I developed some great SMART goals to try and help me get back on track. As I moved throughout the week, I was able to monitor them each day. In the Living on Purpose course, I teach that there are 2 kinds of goals, happiness goals and success goals, and they're not always friends. My success goal for this week was largely based around measurables in my work performance. My happiness goal, on the other hand, was more about getting back into my routines and systems that I have in place to make me feel at peace with the work I'm doing. So here we are on Friday, and I can tell you bluntly and honestly that I didn't get nearly as close to the success goal as I had hoped. But my happiness goal was a much bigger win because I was able to get some of my rhythm back in my work life. Because I use SMART goals for both my happiness and success outcomes this week, I know exactly how far off I am from what I thought I would accomplish and can set more realistic expectations and have a better chance at winning at both happiness and success next week. Establishing SMART goals for yourself is relatively easy once you've practiced it a few times, but there's an added layer when you start trying to do it at the organizational level, so let me give you that example. This week's organizational level of developing goals actually comes from the group of participants in the Living on Purpose course I'm currently teaching. Although this might not seem like a typical organization, I can promise you that the group of people that make up any class meet all the criteria for an organization and even have their own culture. This week, I was teaching the module on building accountability, and the practical application requires the participants to monitor and measure how consistently they follow through with a particular decision they chose. Hopefully, you can see the connections on how this was helping them to start developing goals at the personal level, but I want to explain how I turned this into an organizational goal. Just like the goals for any other organization, each person was given their own specific criteria to measure their performance, but they also understood that we would share these as a group next week and learn from the different types of accountability that worked for each person. I was able to turn this into a SMART goal because everyone knew what their part was. They knew how their individual results would contribute to the group results. They knew exactly what actions they had to do, and then it had to be done before next week's class. The trick to making SMART goals at the organizational level is taking the individual SMART goals and making sure everyone understands how they contribute to the success or failure of the goals of the group as a whole. Hopefully, next week we come together and everyone did their part and is able to learn from each other's experiences, which will increase both the success and happiness of the class. This is a practical example of a phrase that has become somewhat cliched, we're all in this together. It takes effective leadership to get the collective we to understand how and why that statement is true. So let's look at that leadership example. This week's example of developing goals at the leadership level also comes from the Living on Purpose class, but focuses on a leadership decision I had to make as a result of some unfolding circumstances. So let me set the scene. First of all, a few students were running behind, so we had a late start. Second, no one had completed their practical application exercise from the prior week, so we had to take the time to go over that and complete it. Third, I'm teaching this course in a borrowed space and want to respect the agreed upon time frame for the course. I had a decision to make, and then I had to create a SMART goal to make sure I effectively followed through with that decision. I know how important the building accountability module is to the success of the remainder of the course, so I decided we would only cover one module this week, and I would have to adjust the schedule going forward. This is absolutely not what I wanted to do, nor is it in line with my personal values. However, as I always say in this segment, effective leadership is about putting the values of we over the values of me. It is my responsibility as the leader of this course to ensure the participants get the maximum benefit. In order to accomplish this, I crafted a new SMART goal for this week's class, which is to ensure 100% of the participants fully understood the key concepts of building accountability and completed the practical application exercise by the end of class that day. This is how I use the SMART goal to meet the needs and values of the individual members of the organization. I then crafted a new SMART goal to adjust the schedule over the next 2 weeks to ensure we weren't compromising time in any other modules. This is how I use a SMART goal to make sure we're meeting the needs and values of the class as a whole. Making these kinds of decisions is usually difficult and can often involve some degree of compromise. I won't know until the end of this class how well those two SMART goals helped me accomplish both finishing the course on time and ensuring the students were able to get all of the information and participate in all of the activities to get the full benefit of the course. But what I do know is it gives me a solid, values-based plan, and at the end of it all, I'll know exactly how far I was or was not off. Using SMART goals from a leadership perspective is very helpful in project management, long-term planning, and all the other visionary parts of leadership, but it's also something super practical in day-to-day operations. Thanks for joining me this week, and I hope you learned a few things about better ways to develop goals for yourself or your organization. Remember, goals are just a measurement of how close you came to something you thought you could do. Regardless of whether you fail or succeed at meeting a goal, and whether or not it's a happiness goal or a success goal, it should always result in a lesson learned and give you a blueprint in making a more informed decision and course of action next time. Evaluate a few goals you have for yourself and ask yourself, is this just an idea or a dream? Or am I actually making a specific, measurable, action-oriented, timely, realistic goal for myself? And if they aren't, then invest the time to turn them into SMART goals. Because if you aren't bought in, you sold out.